Today we're going to consider a few thoughts from Psalm 2. Psalm 2. Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, You are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, you shall shatter them like earthenware. Now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence, and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, that he not become angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in him. As we think about what this psalm says, there's several things we could talk about, but I want us to just consider a couple points briefly here today. Man has a history of rebelling against God and sinning against him and violating his law all the way back in the beginning, starting with Adam and Eve, that they sinned, they violated the law of God. Man has continued to do that. Even today, we continue to sin and violate the law of God. Well, here in Psalm 2, it mentions specifically, it talks about the nations in an uproar, the peoples devising a vain thing, but then it says the kings of the earth, even the rulers of the people, the kings of the earth, they are rebelling against God. They are taking their stand against him. You have throughout history rulers who disregard God, rulers who want to be gods themselves or seen as gods to the people. And you have, this has been going on for centuries. But here in Psalm 2, this is not just making a general statement that generally speaking people rebel against God, or generally speaking you have rulers who do not want to submit to the laws of God. This is talking about something specific. This is a prophecy pointing to Jesus and the things that would happen with him and those who were opposed to him. This psalm is actually quoted by the disciples in their prayer in Acts chapter 4 and made the point that this is what was going on with Jesus and how the rulers opposed him and had him crucified. And so when it talks about the kings of the earth take their stand, the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, that's Jesus. His anointed is Jesus, and the rulers are taking their stand against him. And so you have an attempt by the rulers at that time that here is Jesus, here's the one who claimed to be the Son of God. They didn't want to submit to God. They didn't want to follow the laws of God, at least in the way that God had intended them to. And so here was their opportunity to defeat God. Here was their opportunity to cast those cords off of them, that they were not going to be bound to submit to God any longer. So what did they do? They did the worst thing that they could do to Jesus. They not only killed him, which would have been bad, but they did more than that. They crucified him. With the act of crucifixion was not just killing someone. It was a painful and humiliating death on a cross, a very public death. That's what they did with Jesus. That's how they were trying to cast off their cord and say, we are going to be the ones who are the heads. There's no God but us. But it says there in verse 4, he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Acts chapter 2, Peter makes the point that all of this was part of the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. That this was according to God's plan. This was something that God knew was going to happen. And so when man decided, well, we're just going to crucify Jesus and we're just going to get rid of him, that wasn't going to defeat the plan of God. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them because they did their worst that they could do to Jesus in crucifying him. But they still weren't victorious over Jesus and over the plan of God. Because what happened after Jesus was crucified? 3 days later, he was raised from the dead. He was resurrected. And so the Lord sits in heaven. The Lord scoffs at their plans. The Lord laughs at them. It's what Paul talked about in Colossians chapter 2 and verse 15, that when he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. Through the resurrection, the Lord was proving that man did the worst that they could do to stop the plan of God. They crucified Jesus. That was the worst they could do to stop the plan of God. And the Lord triumphed over them. The Lord was victorious over them because Jesus did not remain in the grave. Jesus was raised from the dead. And so you have those who would rebel against God, and whether it's rulers or others, people rebel against God. But Psalm 2 shows us that we cannot rebel against God and win. We cannot defeat God. We cannot stop God. And so this psalm is not only a prophecy of Jesus and the things that would happen surrounding him and his death and his crucifixion and his resurrection, but also it's a reminder to us that because we cannot fight against God, and because God, through Christ, and that example with his resurrection, has the power to raise people from the dead, we can have hope in him. The last words of this psalm: how blessed are all who take refuge in him. Let us not rebel against God and try to cast off the rule of God from our lives. We can't do that. But don't even attempt to do that. Instead, let us submit to God and follow God and take our refuge in him. Because in him, and only in the Lord, can we have this hope. Thanks.